The desert had seen miracles and massacres, but never this. In the winter of 1177, 500 Christian knights stood beneath the burning sky of Palestine, facing 26,000 men who had sworn to erase them from the earth. The wind carried dust, sweat, and prophecy across the dunes. The gold and white banners of Jerusalem trembled, not in triumph, but in defiance. They were not riding for victory. They were riding for faith, for survival, for a city that was already preparing for its funeral. The kingdom of Jerusalem was a shadow of its former self, bleeding, fractured, and leaderless. At its heart sat a boy barely 16, Baldwin IV, the Leper King. His flesh betrayed him daily, his fingers wrapped in linen, his face hidden behind a mask of silver. Yet his eyes burned brighter than any sun. To his soldiers, he was a relic of Christendom, to his enemies, a ghost. But in that frail frame, history would find the courage of an empire. Far to the south, a storm was gathering, green banners rippling over an army that stretched to the horizon. Sultan Saladin, unifier of Islam, conqueror of Egypt and Syria, was marching north. 26,000 men, Mamluk cavalry, Sudanese spearmen, Turkish archers, moved like a living sea across the desert. They were not an army. They were judgment, and their destination was Jerusalem. Saladin's commanders boasted of an easy campaign, of cities surrendering before the crescent standard. In their minds, the cross would be broken within a week. In the great halls of Jerusalem, panic spread faster than prayer. "Retreat to the walls," one noble urged. "We cannot face him. He outnumbers us 50 to 1, another murmured. "Seal the gates and pray for mercy." But Baldwin rose, pale and trembling, his frail body shaking as he leaned upon his sword. "If God wills it," he said quietly, "then I will ride. I will meet him in the field, for Jerusalem does not yield while I draw breath." The boy's words silenced the chamber. What began as madness became faith. The knights of the temple, sworn to Christ, knelt before him. The Hospitallers followed, their black mantles gleaming with crosses of white. Across the land, messengers rode to every castle and chapel. When the banners were gathered, they numbered only 500 knights and a few thousand footmen, nothing against Saladin's legions. Yet to those who saw them ride out from Ascalon, it felt as though angels were marching to war. The desert wind howled around them, stinging eyes and drying lips. Still, they pressed onward, 500 sparks of defiance riding into the storm. At the head of the column rode Baldwin. His silver mask hid the ravages of disease, but not the fire in his gaze. His right hand trembled upon the reins, and yet it did not falter. Beside him rode Odo de Saint-Amand, Grand Master of the Templars, a man forged in battle and prayer. "Sire," he said softly, "we ride to our deaths." Baldwin turned, his voice thin but unwavering. "Then let us ride," he answered, "as though we were already immortal." The words lingered like a benediction, carried by the wind across the burning sands. From the plains of Egypt came the glimmer of steel and the thunder of marching feet. Saladin's banners unfurled like emerald waves under the white sun. His host moved with impossible confidence, 26,000 men bound by faith and vengeance. Saladin himself rode a black Arabian stallion, his bearing regal, his gaze steady. Around him fluttered the emblems of Damascus, Aleppo, Cairo, cities united under his crescent. His lieutenants rode close, their eyes full of arrogance. "The Franks will flee before we draw our blades," one young emir laughed. Saladin's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Perhaps," he murmured, "but even lions fight hardest when cornered." The march was relentless. Gaza fell without a cry. Ramla surrendered in silence. Fortresses that had defied sieges for years opened their gates before Saladin's shadow. Each victory fed his pride. Each mile brought him closer to Jerusalem. He left his siege engines behind, confident he would not need them. The Sultan believed this campaign to be divine destiny, swift and bloodless, but destiny was waiting for him elsewhere, hidden beyond the dunes. The desert grew quieter the closer he came to Montgisard. The drums faded, the air thickened, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Among his soldiers, laughter began to fade, replaced by unease. They marched through a valley of stone and sun, their armor blazing under the noon light. Then, on a distant ridge, a single flash of light, a reflection of the sun off steel. A Mamluk scout frowned, raising his hand to shield his eyes. "What is that?" he whispered. The question died on his tongue. The answer came like thunder. From the hills, the blast of horns echoed across the plain. Then, an avalanche of hooves. 500 armoured knights erupted from the ridges, lances levelled, banners whipping in the wind. At their front rode Baldwin IV, the Leper King, his silver mask gleaming like a mirror to heaven. Behind him, the Templars and Hospitallers thundered forward, crying out in one voice, "Deus vult!"
God wills it!
The desert trembled beneath the charge. Dust exploded, horses screamed. And for the first time in years, the armies of Christendom rode not to defend, but to strike. Below them, the vast ranks of Saladin's army froze in disbelief. Some thought they were seeing a mirage. Others whispered of angels. A wall of steel and faith was descending upon them. 500 men against 26,000. It was not a battle. It was a miracle in motion. The impossible had come to meet them. Some thought demons had fallen from the sky. Others swore angels rode among the Franks. From the ridges, the charge of 500 knights thundered down like divine fury. Dust exploded beneath their hooves, lances levelled, banners snapping in the wind. Saladin spun in his saddle, his voice slicing through the chaos. "Close the ranks! Hold your ground!" But his words drowned beneath the roar of the storm. The first impact struck like thunder. Steel against flesh, faith against empire. Horses collided with men, spears shattered. The front line of Saladin's great army folded like parchment beneath the weight of the charge. The sands of Montgisard turned red. The sound of war filled the heavens. Screams, steel, the neighing of terrified beasts. Baldwin rode at the heart of it all, his silver mask gleaming through the smoke. His body was frail, eaten by disease, but adrenaline burned away the weakness. He fought not as a dying boy, but as a man chosen by heaven itself. His sword rose and fell, cutting through the chaos like a blade of light. Behind him, his knights struck with the precision of fate. The Templars crashed through the flanks, their war cry shaking the dunes. "Deus vult!" God wills it. Beside Baldwin, the Templar Grandmaster Odo de Saint-Amand bellowed over the noise. "Strike deep, break their heart." The formation wheeled like a living storm. Knights circled, charged again and again, merciless, unstoppable. The Muslim cavalry tried to regroup, encircling the Crusaders from both sides. But the desert betrayed them. The sand shifted beneath their mounts, their arrows scattered by the wind. Every attempt to close the trap only gave Baldwin more room to strike. The thin white line of Jerusalem, 500 souls tore holes through an empire. Each impact sent ripples of panic across Saladin's host. Saladin's personal guard rushed to his side.
"My lord, withdraw!"
one shouted, but the Sultan's eyes flared with fury. "No, I will not flee before a handful of dying Franks." Yet even he could see it. The impossible was happening. His formations broke apart, the ranks collapsing under the sheer audacity of the charge. The once ordered army had become a storm of chaos. Arrows flew without aim, striking friend and foe alike. Camels broke loose, trampling soldiers in blind terror. Trumpets blared meaningless orders, drowned beneath the screams. And through it all, Baldwin advanced, his knights cutting through the sea of men like fire through parchment. Dust rose thick as smoke, choking lungs, blinding eyes. The ground shook beneath hooves and steel. Baldwin's silver mask was streaked with blood, his horse slick with sweat. To his enemies, he seemed not human, but myth, death itself riding in the shape of a king. Wherever he turned, his knights followed, their armor cracked, their arms numb, but their faith unbroken. They fought surrounded, outnumbered 50 to 1, yet never faltered. There was no thought of retreat, no plea for mercy, only one shared oath, to make every heartbeat count before the desert took them all. Odo de Saint-Amand's voice cut through the din once more. "Close ranks! Strike from the flanks! Do not let them breathe." The Templars obeyed. They smashed into the sides of the Muslim lines with the fury of iron and prayer. Their heavy horses crushed light cavalry like dry leaves. The enemy's discipline dissolved, their courage drowned in dust and blood. Saladin's lieutenants screamed for order. Amir al-Adil, the Sultan's brother, shouted until his throat bled.
"Hold! The Sultan commands you to stand!"
But it was too late. The tide had turned. What began as a march of triumph was now a rout of terror. The battlefield became madness incarnate. Men fled from shadows that weren't there. Banners vanished into storms of sand. Saladin's golden standard swayed, then faltered. Seeing it fall, the Crusaders roared as one, driving forward with a fury born of exhaustion and faith. In that moment, the great army of Islam broke. The Sultan's guards seized his reins, dragging him from the killing ground. "My lord, live to fight again," cried Aladil. Saladin's face, once calm as stone, twisted with rage. "By God, I will return," he shouted, before spurring his stallion southward. Away from the inferno, he could no longer command. The sight of their sultan's retreat shattered the last fragments of resistance. Panic became contagion. Men threw down their weapons, trampled one another in their haste to flee. By sunset, the desert was a graveyard. 20,000 bodies lay still beneath a crimson sky. The survivors, Saladin among them, rode through the night without rest, haunted not by the enemy, but by their own disbelief. The invincible had been broken. The conqueror of empires had been undone by 500 men who refused to die quietly. And amid the ruin, King Baldwin dismounted. His legs trembled. His breath came ragged. He knelt beside his horse, its flanks heaving, its sides streaked with blood. Around him lay his knights, half dead, half divine. Out of 500 who had charged, barely half remained. He pressed his sword into the sand and whispered, his voice barely audible through cracked lips, "Not by my hand, Lord, but by yours." The desert wind carried away the words, a prayer, a confession, and the sound of history turning. As night fell, silence descended over Montgisard. The wind no longer howled, the earth no longer trembled. Only the dying moaned, and the horses stamped wearily in the dark. The moon rose over a plain strewn with broken spears, fallen banners, and bodies beyond counting. That morning the sand had gleamed gold. Now it was black with blood. Baldwin stood among his surviving men, his armor dented, his mask streaked with crimson. They had done the impossible. 500 had shattered 26,000. Giovanni of Ibelin, Baldwin's cousin, approached, his voice trembling. "Sire, we have won. Against all reason, all odds, we have won." The young king turned toward the horizon, where faint fires flickered. Saladin's retreating army. He tried to speak, but emotion caught in his throat. At last he whispered, "It was not our strength, it was the hand of God." He lifted his mask, revealing a face ravaged by disease, yet radiant with peace. Odo de Saint-Amand knelt before him, driving his sword into the blood-soaked sand. "Jerusalem lives because you did not yield," he said. "You are more than a king. You are God's weapon." Baldwin shook his head weakly. "No, brother," he murmured. "I am only his servant." The desert wind swept over them, carrying away the smoke and the echoes of battle. Far to the south, Saladin's shattered army vanished into the night. The once invincible Sultan had escaped, but his pride, his legend, and his invincibility were buried beneath the sands of Montgisard. Saladin's army limped south beneath a sky of fire. His pride was shattered. Behind him, the Crusader camp burned with torchlight. Priests moved among the wounded, whispering blessings over men who no longer had strength to pray. Those who survived knelt in silence, too weary even to remove their armor. When dawn rose, it revealed a miracle made flesh. A boy king, dying of disease, who had faced an empire and triumphed. For a single morning, the kingdom of Jerusalem stood not as a relic of faith, but as its living flame, burning bright against the endless desert. Morning broke over Montgisard like a ghost. The air was heavy with the scent of death and iron. Smoke drifted from shattered wagons and torn banners. Crows wheeled above the plain, their cries echoing over the silence that follows slaughter. Baldwin IV stood upon a rise. His knights gathered the fallen standards, the green flags of Islam planted beside the golden crosses of Jerusalem. Even victory felt sacred and sorrowful. Giovanni of Ibelin approached, his armor scorched, his face blackened with dust. "Sire," he said softly, "Saladin has vanished into the south. His men scatter. Some beg for water." Baldwin's eyes remained on the horizon. "Let them live," he murmured. "Enough have died in this desert. Mercy was rare in holy war, yet none dared question the king. Messengers arrived with news of captured treasure, gold, silk, weapons, and the lost glory of Saladin's pride. But Baldwin barely heard them. His body trembled with fever. Blood touched his lips when he coughed, yet his gaze burned with serenity. Odo de Saint-Amand dismounted and knelt beside him. "God has made you his champion, my lord," he said. "No man will doubt his favor now." Baldwin smiled faintly. "A champion?" he whispered. "No, brother, only his witness. He struck them down. I merely stood to see it." His words hung in the air, soft as prayer. That night, they camped beside a stream. The wounded moaned softly as priests sang hymns. The wind carried the scent of myrrh and smoke, and some swore they saw a glow upon the horizon. Not fire, but something holy. Far to the south, Saladin rode in silence. His guards kept their distance, their eyes downcast. At last, one dared to ask, "My lord, how could this happen? 500 against 26,000. Saladin's jaw tightened. He said nothing for a long while, then murmured, "The hand of their God is heavy, but the desert remembers all. One day I shall return, and the Lion of Jerusalem will not rise again." Word of the victory raced ahead of the knights. By the time they reached the olive groves outside Jerusalem, the whole city had heard. Villagers poured into the roads, throwing flowers and crying out blessings. For the first time in years, fear was replaced by song. At the head of the column rode Baldwin, his silver mask reflecting torchlight, his armor scarred but gleaming. To the people, he was no longer the Leper King. He was deliverance itself. As he approached the gates, bells rang from every tower, echoing like thunder. Children ran barefoot beside his horse, shouting, "Long live Baldwin! Long live the king!" The Patriarch of Jerusalem waited at the gates of the Holy Sepulchre, his priests holding candles that flickered in the desert wind. He knelt as the boy king dismounted, tears glistening in his eyes. "My son," he said, "the Lord has delivered his city through your hands." Baldwin shook his head weakly. "Not my hands, father," he whispered. "His mercy." Inside, the knights laid their swords before the altar, the sound of steel on stone echoing like thunder. Odo de Saint-Amand watched from the doorway as Baldwin knelt before the relic of the true cross. "He should have died out there," Odo whispered. Giovanni answered quietly, "Perhaps he did. And what stands before us now is something greater." Outside, the bells rang through the night, and the people sang beneath a sky full of stars. In that moment, the kingdom of Jerusalem felt eternal. Later, in his chamber, Baldwin sat alone by a window, gazing over the city he had saved. His body trembled with pain, yet a faint smile lingered on his lips. "So long as I breathe," he murmured, "no man shall take you." The words drifted into the night, a promise to his God, his people, and his dying kingdom. Winter came early that year. The winds from the Judean hills howled through Jerusalem's towers. The fire that had once burned within the king now flickered weakly. His hands cracked and bled. His strength faded with each sunrise. But still, pilgrims came from across Christendom to see the boy who had defied Saladin. They called him the new David, the shepherd king who slew the giant. Yet in the quiet of his palace, Baldwin prayed not for praise, but for peace. Montgisard, he believed, was no triumph of arms. It was a warning. God lent his hand for a moment to show what faith could do, but he would not fight their wars forever. As the years passed, Saladin rebuilt. The humiliation burned within him, but so too did respect. When his generals mocked the Leper King, he silenced them. "You speak of disease," he said coldly, "but that boy shamed me before God and men. Pray that you face death as he did, without fear." 2 kings, one broken, one unbowed, watched the same stars from opposite ends of the desert, waiting for destiny's return. In 1185, the kingdom of Jerusalem stood in uneasy peace. Its young king was dying. Baldwin lay in his chamber, sunlight falling through coloured glass onto his wasted hands. Giovanni knelt beside him. "Do you hear it?" Baldwin whispered. "Hear what, my lord?" "The wind," Baldwin said faintly. "The same wind that blew across Montgisard. It still carries the sound of hooves." Giovanni bowed his head, tears in his eyes. "All of Christendom remembers," he said. Baldwin smiled weakly. "Then tell them this. It was not our swords that won the day, but our faith. For God is strongest in the weak." Outside, the bells of the Holy Sepulchre tolled. Baldwin whispered, "The Lord is my strength and my shield." And when the bells ceased, the Lion of Jerusalem was gone. The city mourned for 40 days. From peasant to noble, they lined the streets as his coffin passed, not for a leper, but for a king. In Damascus, when the news reached Saladin, he bowed his head and said softly, "May God have mercy on him. He was a king." And so, 2 great enemies were bound forever, one by death, the other by memory. Years later, when Saladin finally took Jerusalem, no blood was spilled. The chroniclers wrote that mercy ruled that day. "Perhaps," they whispered, "the spirit of the Leper King still walked its walls. For courage," they said, "does not die with kingdoms.